Hi everyone, it's John from RFM Calc, and today, as part of our series taking a deep dive look into our key reports that we provide as part of the RFM Calc service, we're going to have a look at our new versus returning customer reports. So as you can see from our account plan comparison table here, the new versus returning reports are available on all our account plans, much like most of our key reports. You can see from free right up till huge. If I click the overlay again, you can see these reports are basically based around the data of determining who's a new customer and who's a returning customer. So this has been a core part of the RFM Calc reporting suite since we launched. I think it's really, really interesting data. It's data that's obviously requested by a lot of people. It's data that's really nice to see, and we can generate a lot of interesting charts and data tables off the back of it. I think 10 years ago, viewing new versus returning customers on e-commerce platforms, was actually quite difficult. There weren't many e-commerce platforms that provided this reporting out of the box. Nowadays, there are more that support this natively. So Shopify has a form of this with returning versus new customers, and you can apply filters to other reports as well. Magento doesn't have this built in, but it is part of the BI reporting suite that you can integrate with Magento that comes included if you're on Magento Commerce. So there are platforms that are increasingly offering this, but it's still not core to most, and also it's not presented in a brilliant way on a lot of e-commerce platforms. So that's really the key reason we wanted to make sure it was included front and center with RFM Calc. So the key question you might be asking is, why is new versus returning customer data important? So the short answer is that if you want to scale an e-commerce business, in 99% of cases, you're going to need repeat customers to do that. So whatever product or service you sell, in order to keep growing, you can't just rely on first-time customers. There's a finite number of those in the world for your product and service. You can't wait for new customers to be born. You're going to need existing customers to return and spend more with you. So there are obviously exceptions to that. There are businesses out there that literally have a lifetime value of one order and one customer, and that's fine. But in 99% of cases, as I say, to scale your business, you're going to need those customers to come back. And there's a lot of benefits to that. Returning customers obviously cost less to bring back to the site than acquiring new customers, again, in 99% of cases. And also, once you have a returning customer, once a customer has placed that second order, they're then much more likely to actually come back again and place a third and fourth order. And also the time between the orders, between the second and third and fourth, is also lowered, so they'll come back quicker as well, and that's detailed in other reports that we'll touch on in this series. But just getting an overview, therefore, of that new versus returning customer data and understanding how many customers are new, how many are returning, your overall mix, how that mix is changing over time, is therefore really, really important to understand how your e-commerce business is growing. And not only is it important for you, if you're presenting this data to other people in the business, or you're an agency managing e-commerce clients, knowing this mix and knowing how this mix changes over time for your customers or for your senior management or your C-level people who you report to, is really, really important. And it's very easy to present this data, actually. It's very easy to digest. I think anyone within a business can understand this data and see how that mix is changing, and therefore see how your e-commerce business is growing and how it's positive. Again, in 99% of cases, if your returning customers are increasing and you're getting more revenue from returning customers, that's going to be a positive, because those customers are going to cost you less and they're going to be more loyal in the long term. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to explain is just how we determine who's a new customer and who's a returning customer based on your order data. So this is really, really straightforward. If I just go to a test Shopify project I've got here, obviously this is the same for any e-commerce platform, and I go to my standard column mappings. So obviously you can change these column mappings every time you schedule a new report, but you can save default ones against the project to speed that process up. And you can see here we've got a customer ID column. So you need to set this every time you schedule a report. It's a required field when you schedule a report with RFM Calc. So typically email address is normally a good identifier. So that's what most e-commerce platforms will export for you as an ID, and then you can obviously select that when you import. What I would say is if you have a better internal customer identifier, RFM Calc is really, really flexible, so you can use any column value here. So if you have an internal customer ID, you can specify that. If you log an ID against the customer in a persistent basis, so even if they've not registered an account, if you have an ID registered, kind of logged against them with cookies and sessions and so on, you can use that as well. It's really, really flexible. But for most people, most businesses, most e-commerce platforms, email is a sensible ID, because even if a customer has multiple email addresses, when they come back to your site, they're going to use the same email to place their orders. That's typically how it works. So personally, I have different email addresses for every e-commerce shop I use, just a different prefix at the same domain. But that is the same every time I come back and place an order. Obviously, I'm not going to change that when I place an order on an existing e-commerce site that I've shopped with before. Why would I change my email? It doesn't make sense. So that's normally a good identifier. This is, as I mentioned, a required field, so we can't and we won't import orders where you don't specify a valid customer ID. So if you specify a column and that column is blank on particular rows for orders, we'll just basically ignore those, because it's so crucial that we understand the customer identifier, that we basically just don't try and process reports that don't have one. So it's a required field when you schedule a report. It's very easy to set, and like I say, every e-commerce platform will export this in some form, normally as a customer email address. Just one thing to note as well, you can exclude certain IDs as standard in RFM Calc as well when you schedule a report. So you've got this field here for customer ID exclusion list. So basically you can comma separate a list of IDs. So if you want to exclude, if it was emails, a list of emails, maybe for your development agency or your internal staff, you can just add a list here and we'll automatically take those out. Obviously the beauty of RFM Calc is because we're working with CSV files, you can manipulate the file before you upload it. So you can remove any internal IDs or test IDs before you upload the file. That's fine, but just for ease, we also give you the option to exclude as well. The exclusion list can do some pretty clever stuff as well, so you can use wildcards. So for example, if you wanted to exclude everyone from yourdomain.com, you could just use 3 asterisks here before yourdomain.com, and that will exclude every ID that contains or starts with or ends with, contains, starts with, ends with, basically on a partial match basis, yourdomain.com. So if you wanted to exclude all your internal staff orders, you could just use yourdomain.com based on the email domain that your staff use, and that will exclude them for you as well. So there's help here. You get this same help when you schedule a report as well. So it's really, really easy to exclude customer IDs. Great. So once you've obviously mapped your columns and selected your customer ID and processed your report, we'll then generate our fantastic many page long e-commerce report for you. So I wanted to give a few examples of real data, obviously completely anonymized for the purposes of this video, in terms of the new versus returning section. So if I just start with this site here. So this is a small kind of Magento site, about 4 years, just shy of 4 years worth of data, and about 2.5 million in turnover. And you can see, if I just click the new versus returning link here, you've got easy nav links to all the kind of core sections. So if I scroll down, the first thing we'll present is basically new versus returning customer revenue on a month by month basis. So you can see here, we've got returning customer revenue in blue, new customer revenue in red. And you can see it's really easy, just hover over. This is a UK site, so the revenue's in GBP. Obviously, RFM Calc supports all world currencies. And you can just see over time in a really visual way how the new versus returning mix is changing for your site. We split our charts into 24-month chunks, so just to prevent the columns being really, really tiny if there's more months than that in, or having to scroll and so on. So you can see it goes back down here. So we've got basically 2 charts to cover the full 2-year time period of this particular site, 4-year time period, I should say, of this particular site. We also do order count in a slightly different way, just to again give a nice visualization of how orders are changing for new versus returning customers rather than just revenue. And then we've also got the percentage, which is quite useful to look at over time. So this is a percentage of orders that are from new customers and percentages that are from returning customers. So you can see for this particular site, it was fairly steady. And then in around March this year, that's really shifted to kind of even out into 50-50 almost in terms of new versus returning customers, whereas before there was still a lot of new customer acquisition. So what's probably happened as this site has scaled back its spend on new customer acquisition is realistically what's happened, because you can see the revenue hasn't increased. So they've probably made the decision that actually acquiring customers at the moment is quite expensive. So we're going to scale back our efforts on acquiring new customers and focus more on retaining existing customers, which can quite often happen in e-commerce. That's not an unusual strategy. If you're paying really high cost per click, for example, or cost per acquisition in other paid channels, be it Google Ads, be it Facebook advertising, at some point businesses will decide, hey, we probably need to stop spending now and focus more on our existing customers. Because by this point, you've obviously hopefully built up a substantial list of existing customers, you've got them on your mailing list, and you can target more repeat business rather than just going after new customers. So we also present this data in a really nice, easy to digest data table. So you can see we've got new versus returning for every month here. The cool thing about how we do this is that because it's a proper HTML table, I can easily just copy that straight into the new Excel spreadsheet. Really, really easy. And we structure our tables purposely to allow you to do that really, really easily. So we present data tables, one, to give you the data on the report, but two, to make it really, really easy to put into Excel as well. So we've got that. We've also split, and this is quite interesting, we've added this recently because it gives a nice overview. We also give you a split year by year. So you can look on a yearly basis, the new versus returning customer revenue. And then we've got this nice chart here, which shows on a percentage basis, year by year, new versus returning. And you can see this site in particular, obviously when you start, new customers are very much predominant, 90%, but over time it kind of plateaus and the new versus returning comes together. I'll show another couple of examples because that's really, really typical when you look at e-commerce sites over time, that kind of leveling out of new versus returning. And then we also, for completeness, give you an overall picture of new versus returning revenue as well. So for this site, 71% of their revenue, or nearly 72, has come from new customers, with 28 from returning. And obviously that will change over time. You can also run different time periods. You can upload different amounts of data to RFM Calc. It's really, really customizable. I think the thing to remember is the first time we see a customer, based on the time period you've uploaded, we will think they're new. So they might not actually be new. So if you, for example, if this site uploaded data just from starting in 2021 rather than 2018, obviously there were customers who will have placed orders before who will think are new because we don't know. So basically for new versus returning, it's quite helpful to look at a nice long time period to actually understand who is really new and who is returning. So that's a fairly typical site there. Let's have a look at some other ones. So I've got this different Magento site here. So if I just go to the top, you can see this is a very different business. So shorter time period, so only about 3 years, but you can see much bigger turnover, so around 47 million in that period. But then you can instantly see, just looking at this summary, that they've had nearly 250,000 orders, but from less than 4,000 customers. So you can instantly tell, obviously, if you understand e-commerce and you experience it looking at this data, that this site is going to have a very high repeat customer rate. The reason for that is this is a B2B site. So they're not really targeting new customer acquisitions. Obviously, they want new customers to come in, but you have to register for a trade account. You have to log in to see any pricing. It's very much targeted at repeat custom. So if I scroll down to new versus returning, you can see that certainly this year, the latest year, you can see the returning customer revenue is virtually everything. That tiny little red slice at the top is new customer revenue. So you can see in February 2021, that's around £8,240. But returning customer revenue was over 1.5 million. So repeat business is the absolute driver for this e-commerce brand. And you can see new versus returning customers as well. Obviously, for their first month that we have, which was October 2018, there was new customer revenue in there, and that's the biggest chunk. But then once we've identified those customers and once we have them logged, you can see it's very much repeat business. You can see the percentage. It's nearly 100%, 99.44% of revenue in May came from returning customers. And then when we look at the yearly breakdown as well, you can see again, for the first year we have, the returning customers were not 100% because we obviously didn't know they were returning customers, or they may have been new customers anyway, depending on how you look at it. But then over time, it's really become, as I say, virtually 100% of customers who come back to the site are repeat customers. And that's reflected in the overall contribution as well, where you can see 98.4% of the revenue, so over £46 million for this business, comes from returning customers. So that's a very extreme example, but as I say, if you've got a business like this, or if you're looking at multiple businesses, it really reflects in how this data is presented and the figures you see based on the type of business that you're looking at. So for the next example, this is another Magento site. The difference here is that although there's, again, kind of 250,000 rows, this is over a much longer time period. So this is nearly 7 years worth of data. Now, this is actually really useful when you're looking at new versus returning customers to really determine who is genuinely new and who is genuinely returning. So if you can get the data from right back when your site launched, then that's great, because they will be a really genuinely new customer. Whereas if you've only got the last couple of years of data and that's all you're uploading to RFM Calc, then we will obviously think any customers who place in that first month who haven't seen before are new customers, when in reality they might not actually be new customers. So it's actually quite interesting to look at this over a long time period. So if I scroll down to the new versus returning section, you can see, again, you've got the monthly kind of split, and you can see that looks fairly consistent. It doesn't seem to be changing. Again, this is split into 4 charts this time because there's 7 years of data. So split into 2 years each is 7 charts, or 4 charts, sorry, to cover the 7 years. So we've got the same reports in terms of new versus returning. You can see certainly the most recent year that the percentage has kind of leveled off in terms of new versus returning. It's pretty flat at kind of 50-50. You can see it varies month by month, but generally about half the revenue and orders are coming from new customers and half are coming from returning. So what's really interesting when you look over a long time period is to actually look at the yearly view down here. So you've got it split by year, which is really, really useful. Right back from 2014 to 2021. Obviously, again, you can copy and paste this table into Excel really, really easily, do your own kind of calculations off the back of it. But what you can see here is in terms of the new customers versus returning customer percentage, it's really leveled off. So obviously, like all e-commerce sites, when you start out, it's new business, and then over time, the returning has really grown. But what's happened in the last 3 years is it's really leveled. So it's about 50% for 2019, 2020 and 2021. And that's really, really interesting how this figure kind of levels off over time. And that's quite typical, surprisingly typical. So this is interesting in terms of then what do you do? Do you go out and invest more in new customers? Do you try and change this? And that obviously depends on your e-commerce business, on your sector, on your vertical. There's a lot of different things that go into this. But 50-50 is often a good place to be because, as we know, returning customers cost a lot less to bring back to the site than acquiring new customers. So businesses can often find that plateau where they're pretty comfortable. And if they're still growing overall, they can be pretty happy at that kind of new versus returning split without needing to change the makeup of their marketing. So it's an interesting point to get to. That's emphasized by this site. So this is a Shopify site. If I go up to the top, quite a bit more substantial in terms of revenue. So we've got about 4.5 years worth of data, but about $41 million in turnover. So, a fair size site, I would say. And if we go down to the new versus returning, again, you've got the figures month by month, which is useful, and people always like to see this on a month by month basis. It's good to keep track of in terms of revenue, orders, and the percentage split. But once again, if I scroll down to the percentage year by year, you can see again, now this is a completely different site, completely different market, completely different set of customers, completely different vertical, completely different platform as well. This one was Magento, this one was Shopify, but you can see again, you've got this leveling out. So over the last couple of years, it's really leveled out where new customers for this particular site are around 55% and returning is around 45%. So this is quite typical, and this is one of the surprising things we've found when we put this together, because there aren't many e-commerce platforms or systems or reporting tools, we don't know any, where you can actually see this kind of data in such an easy to digest way. And that's really why we built RFM Calc. But you can see this leveling out, again, completely different sites, customers, data, countries that they operate. But again, they've kind of leveled out in terms of how many orders and proportion of revenue, how much proportion of revenue is coming from new customers, and how much is coming from returning customers. So this data is really, really invaluable when you're thinking about, okay, how are we going to approach the business? How much should we be pushing for new customer acquisition? How much should we be investing in customer retention? Knowing this top level overview is really, really useful. And also, it's very, very easy to present this. You can present this to anyone in a business, C-level, whoever you want, and they will understand this chart and understand what's going on because it's so kind of easy to digest and easy to present. Great. So as you can see, this is really intended as a top level overview for new versus returning customers. It gives a really nice, easy to present set of data, easily digestible. There's obviously a lot more detail that you'll want to go into. So in terms of how much those customers spend over their lifetime, that's covered in our lifetime revenue section. In terms of when do those repeat customers actually come back? So if you have a first time customer in January, which months are they actually coming back to purchase again? We'll cover that in full in our cohort analysis. And if you're wondering how long it takes customers on average to come back, we've got a lot of detail about that as well in our time between orders section. But I'll cover all those in future videos because we've been through quite a lot today. So yeah, hopefully that's been useful. Hopefully now you have a really good understanding of our new versus returning customer reports, why it's important to look at this data, what we present to you, and how you can digest this data and really present it to the rest of the business. Thanks for watching. Hope to see you again on a future video. And obviously, if you've got any questions on this or any of our other reports, feel free to get in touch via the site. Thanks, everyone.